Due to the illegal war of aggression by Russian President Vladimir Putin, Ukraine is currently on everyone's lips. So today I would like to start my series of videos in which I talk in a little bit more detail about the countries of our world with Ukraine. Because many people in the world now know the name of the country, but don't really know that much about Ukraine. Located in Eastern Europe, Ukraine is the second largest country on the continent. It is neighboring countries like Poland, Belarus, Russia, Romania, Moldova, Hungary and Slovakia. The country is bordered on the south by the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. Winters in Ukraine are very cold and summers are warm. Ukraine is a parliamentary presidential republic. The capital is Kiev. In addition to the state language Ukrainian, Russian is also spoken as a lingua franca. Ukraine is in the process of transforming itself into a market economy and moving closer to European structures. The German federal government here, for example, is supporting Ukraine on this path. Politicians disagree about the political orientation of their country, though. Some want closer ties to Russia, others, on the other hand, would like Ukraine to turn to the West and maybe even join the European Union. They put a session form down now. Ukraine has almost always been ruled by foreign powers in the past. Temporary independence was achieved in 1918 until 1921, when the country came under the dominance of the communist Soviet Union. Since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and Russia is the successor state of the Soviet Union, in 1991, Ukraine has been an independent state. But Russia's influence on politics in Ukraine is still very large. The political system of Ukraine is based on a presidential parliamentary system of government, as I said. The draft of the Ukrainian constitution was approved by the Verkhovna Rada, that's the Ukrainian parliament, in June 1996. This constitution replaced the constitution of the Ukrainian SSR, which was still valid until 1995. Since then, June 28th has been celebrated as Constitution Day. After the so-called Orange Revolution in 2004, the constitution of Ukraine should be changed in some essential points. The new constitution that came into force in 2006 strengthened parliament and further restricted the powers of the president. The Council of Europe criticized that parts of the constitutional amendments contradict the rule of law. For example, the position of Attorney General is overly powerful. On October 1st in 2010, the Ukrainian Constitutional Court declared the 2004 amendment to the constitution to be unconstitutional and therefore invalid for procedural reasons. This put the 1996 constitution back in effect. The president could now appoint and dismiss the cabinet again without the approval of parliament. After the escape of President Yanukovych, the 2004 constitution was reinstated by the Verkhovna Rada on February 22nd in 2014. The president of Ukraine has far-reaching powers. He proposes candidates to parliament for the posts of prime minister, defense minister and foreign minister. And he can dismiss the prime minister or individual ministers against the will of the parliamentary majority. The head of state also has legislative powers. Under certain conditions, the president can recall parliament. The direct election by the people also gives the president a strong position. The president represents Ukraine in international relations and conducts foreign policy. He is also the supreme commander of the armed forces and can decide to declare a state of emergency. The government of Ukraine consists of the cabinet of ministers. This consists of the Prime Minister, the first Deputy Prime Minister, 3 other Deputy Prime Ministers and the ministers. The Prime Minister is appointed by the President of Ukraine with the approval of Parliament. The other members of the cabinet are appointed by the President on the proposal of the Prime Minister. The term of office of the cabinet is tied to the term of office of the Prime Minister. Due to its double-sided appointment and dismissal, the Cabinet of Ministers is just as dependent on majorities in Parliament for its work as it is on the support of the President. The Parliament of Ukraine, the Supreme Council, the Verkhovna Rada, is a unicameral parliament with 450 seats. Half of the members of parliament are elected directly in the constituencies every 5 years. The second half is made up of the list candidates of those parties who get at least 5% of the votes in a proportional representation. All Ukrainians who are at least 18 years old can vote. Parliament now has greater influence over forming a government and can remove the government following a vote of no confidence without the President's approval. However, the areas of responsibility of Parliament, President and government are not, let's say, always clearly defined in the constitutional text. Ukraine is a centrally governed country. Regional and local self-government bodies have relatively few powers. An exception to this was Crimea, which had special autonomy rights until it was annexed by Russia in 2014. The country is divided into 27 administrative units. Its 24 districts, called oblasts, whose governors are appointed and dismissed by the president, as well as the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the two cities of Kiev and Sevastopol with special status. Since Ukraine's independence in 1991, the official status of the Russian language, with about 17% of the Ukrainian population being ethnic Russians, the interpretation of Tsarist and Soviet history, and the Ukraine's geopolitical orientation have been regular issues in Ukrainian public discourse. But these disputes were always peaceful. Unlike in some other post-Soviet countries such as Estonia, Georgia or Latvia, questions of identity, citizenship and culture were treated in an emphatically liberal manner. Until the adoption of a new pro-Russian language law, which was criticized by the OSCE and the Council of Europe in 2012, Ukrainian was the only official state and administrative language. De facto, however, many regions and institutions of Ukraine acted more or less autonomously in their language policy before 2012 and used Russian and other languages to a greater extent than provided for in the constitution. The media landscape and the book trade in Ukraine were dominated by Russian language products until 2014, and parts of them are still bilingual today. Cultural and geopolitical differences of opinion, as well as a growing media presence of marginal ultra-nationalist groups in Ukraine, were deliberately dramatized and used by Russia during the turmoil of upheaval in the winter of 2013-14 to rally parts of the population of the Donbas basin for a bogus civil war against fascists and Banderovsky. Moscow managed to recruit tens of thousands of Greater Russia militants in both Ukraine and Russia for paramilitary intervention and separatist collaboration in the Donbas. A massive propaganda campaign slandered the incipient democratization, national emancipation, and Europeanization of Ukraine as an anti-Russian, even fascist coup, and its Western orientation as a fundamental violation of Russia's national and geostrategic interests. However, the underlying reason for the increased rhetorical, political, and military aggressiveness of the Russian leadership during and after the Euromaidan revolution is mainly domestic rather than foreign policy. By stoking conspiracy theories and paranoia, they wanted to open up new sources of legitimacy for securing Putin's autocratic rule. The implicit welfare authoritarian social contract between the ruling elite and the people up until the global financial crisis of 2008 could no longer be fulfilled due to stagnant economic development and shrinking real incomes. The Kremlin fears a successfully Europeanized Ukraine as a post-Soviet countermodel to the Putin system of kleptocratic skimming of rents from raw material exports, not least to the EU. The completion of the first Nord Stream gas pipeline through the Baltic Sea from Vyborg to Lubmin at the end of 2012 also reduced the dependency of the Russian state-owned company Gazprom on the Ukrainian gas pipeline system. The increasing energy economic unbundling between Russia and Ukraine contributed significantly to the increasing tensions between the two USSR successor states from 2013 onwards. Due to the Russian military superiority in Crimea and in the Donbas, the Ukrainian leadership declared itself ready for negotiations in September 2014, which only dealt with the return of the Donbas, but not the Black Sea Peninsula, to the Ukrainian State Federation. This consent was also due to the half-heartedness of the West's aid and the widespread understanding in Western Europe and also the Federal Republic of Russia's actions in Crimea and in the Ukraine conflict. The beginning of the Revolution of Dignity on November 21st in 2013 can be seen as the beginning of the Ukraine crisis insofar as this uprising also implicitly represented a questioning of the Russian political system. The reason for the first minor protests was the postponement of the signing of Ukraine's association agreement with the EU. After the bloody dissolution of a tent camp of pro-European intellectuals and students on Kiev's Independence Square, the protests quickly spread. The anti-oligarchic and pro-democracy mass movement culminated on February 21st in 2014 in the victory over the kleptocratic regime of then Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych and his flight from Kiev. Parliament then removed the president from office and called new elections. Russia took the confusing situation after the victory of the Euromaidan as an opportunity to annex Crimea, which is mostly populated by ethnic Russians. That was approximately 60% of the local population. In a cloak and dagger operation, the local parliament was stormed by an apparently Russian special unit. Subsequently, other administrative buildings and Ukrainian barracks were occupied by heavily armed green men, so-called because of their uniforms without rank or national insignia. Under their supervision and under some pressure, the Republican Parliament and a provisional government installed by the Kremlin decided on secession and held a pseudo-referendum. On March 18th in 2014, the treaty on the accession of the Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol to the Russian Federation was signed in Moscow. The war in eastern Ukraine began in spring 2014 with a violent occupation of government buildings in the Luhansk and Donetsk regions by armed pro-Russian groups, often financed, advised and led by Russian nationals. The first set highlights of the rapidly escalating fighting were the violent clashes between pro-Russian and pro-Ukrainian activists on May 2nd in 2014 in Odessa, in which 48 people died, and the shooting down of a Malaysian passenger plane by a Russian Buk anti-aircraft missile on May 17th. Over eastern Ukraine, that killed all 298 inmates. At the beginning of the fighting, the Ukrainian army was poorly equipped and underfunded, and its leadership was partially infiltrated by Russian agents. Therefore, in the early stages of the Russia-Ukrainian war, small but highly motivated volunteer units played an important role, including some units founded by right-wing extremists, such as the infamous AZOV battalion, which is now a regiment created by neo-Nazis in eastern Ukraine. The units, some of which emerged from the self-defense units of Kiev, protests on the Euromaidan, prevented the covert Russian intervention in the Donbas from expanding to other regions, such as the districts of KHARKIV, ZAPORIZHIA, DNIPRO and Mykolaiv. With the exception of a few small semi-regular paramilitary groups, such as the so-called Right Sector Ukrainian Voluntary Corps, all combat units that were initially irregular have now been incorporated into the troops of the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense and Interior. The change of power in Kiev in spring and summer 2019 had no significant impact on the negotiation process until mid-2020, neither within the framework of the so-called Normandy format, which was with Ukraine, Russia, Germany and France, to resolve the problems within the Minsk trilateral contact group, which were Ukraine, Russia and OSCE. Despite a replacement of almost the entire political elite in the wake of the Ukrainian presidential and parliamentary elections in 2019, and the takeover of both the executive and the legislature by an anti-nationalist team led by the new President Volodymyr Zelensky, Russian-Ukrainian relations have picked up little since then. Several attempts to bring the positions closer together, such as the Steinmeier initiative, and proposals for a consultative council or troop disengagement achieved hardly any tangible success by mid-2020. An exception were some controversial prisoner exchanges in which, among other things, a witness for the Dutch MH17 trial detained by Ukraine was allowed to travel to Russia. On February 24th in 2022 now, Russian troops invaded Ukraine. Since then, Russia's war of aggression has continued with increasing severity and destruction. The exact number of victims is unknown, and according to the UNHCR, 5.1 million Ukrainians have so far left their country and fled to neighboring European countries. More than 7 million are fleeing within Ukraine. More than 1.4 million people in eastern Ukraine have no access to running water. The NATO and EU countries decided on extensive sanctions against Russia. Ukraine receives humanitarian aid supplies. Many states, including Germany where I'm sitting, also supply weapons to defend the country, although Germany is not doing enough. And as I make this video, the war is of course ongoing, and unfortunately it is to be feared that it will last for a long time. And if you're interested in more information, you'll find my next video here in the end screen. I'll see you there. Bis gleich.